Excellent talk. Thank you so much. It's great to hear, again, the message of needing to unite and coordinate. And now I'd like to introduce the second speaker that we have the privilege to have today. We have Vice Admiral Paul Madison. Paul has had an illustrious career. He has worked for many years for the Royal Canadian Navy. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Paul. Paul was the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, I believe, up until 2013 when he retired. He then came to Australia a few years later, first as High Commissioner to Canada, another very impressive appointment. And then, fortunately for us, he took the role as Director of the Defence Research Institute at the University of New South Wales. He's going to get mic'd up. So the Defence Research Institute has a mission to increase the collaboration and deepen our relationship between defence, the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and ADFA in Canberra. And I think Paul is ready, so I think I'll pass on to you to know more about it.
This is working? Good. So, good afternoon, everyone. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of Gadigal and pay my respects to the elders, past and present. And thank you, Patrick and Ed, for the invitation to be here today. So, the intro, you figured out I'm Canadian. I served in uniform for 38 years. Interesting that in the Canadian Navy in 1987, the Canadian government announced the intended acquisition of 12 nuclear-powered submarines. And that program lasted 4 years before it was canned, I think in 1991. It was the right capability for Canada then. And just like today, the SSN program is the right capability for Australia. I would say it's time late, but it's the right capability. So I came to Canada, or came to Australia as a diplomat, and was invited to take up an appointment as a professor of practice at Uni New South Wales as the inaugural director of the Defence Research Institute. So just a couple of words about the DRI. What I do, and I have a colleague with me, Josh Sherman, who's based here in Sydney. What we do is work to raise the university's activity rate around defense-related research activities across the full spectrum of defense activity across all faculties, and incentivize and gear researchers towards engaging in solving Australia's most complex defense problems, and to do that in the national interest, increasingly being driven by geostrategic developments in the region. Conversely, we operate up and out from the university, engaging with senior leadership in government and defense, in particular the ADF, the Defense Science Technology Group, with defense primes, SMEs, Tier 2s, with CSIRO, for example, with other universities, engaged here in the Defense Innovation Network in New South Wales, and with international partners. A lot of our defense research funding at UNSW actually comes from the US. But we are engaged not only with the US, but with the UK, obviously, and we can talk about that with AUKUS, but also other like-mindeds, and in the region, especially looking towards Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and India. So there's a lot there to unpack. So 11 months ago, the AUKUS announcement was made, and it was a complete surprise to probably, well, I would think most people here in this room. And what it signaled was a step change in capability for Australia. And that capability, we're not here really to talk much about that capability, but it's about that endurance, about that range, the ability to deploy for months, to remain submerged for extended periods, to be on station and ready to do whatever is required, and then to come home safe. But it's step change also in technology and in culture. When you introduce pressurized water reactors into the mix, that changes everything. And it certainly changes the culture around which the skills have to be geared. The workforce, not just in Navy, but in all of the enabling aspects of generating and sustaining a nuclear power capability here in Australia. So I just thought I'd share a couple of observations about what I think are some of the challenges and opportunities here over the next several years. And then we'll move on, Patrick. But one of the first things I did when the announcement was made last September was contact Vice Admiral Jonathan Meade, who had been appointed as the chief of the Nuclear Propelled Submarine Task Force. Went in to see him to talk about Ed and Patrick, and to remind him and his growing team, which has now become quite a large interdepartmental, multidisciplinary team in Brindabella in Canberra, to remind them that UNSW is that one postgraduate nuclear engineering center of excellence in Australia, thanks to the Tyree family, and to ensure that, and to signal that UNSW, along with other universities, is very much ready to enable, to support, to be part of this great enterprise in generating this nuclear-propelled submarine capability in Australia. I've been in to see Jonathan a couple of times and to see his chief technologist, Dr. Todd Mansell, who's a senior defense scientist from DST Group. The critical path that they are defining as they work with the Americans and the UK towards generating a high readiness deployable SSN, say around 2038, is a very ambitious and daunting one. And I'm sure there's many who could argue that we're already astern station in terms of the critical path to getting to 2038. And the long pole in the tent, I think, will always be people. And so that's kind of the issue I think we're trying to get after here this afternoon. Just a couple of words about the conventional submarines that Australia and like-minded navies operate. It's a step change from an SSK to an SSN, SSK being the conventional powered submarine. But even with an SSK, like the Collins-class boats, these are some of the most complex and dense machines on the planet. And they operate in perhaps the most dangerous environment of all. You put human beings at 500 feet, that tends to focus, get people's attention. And if something goes wrong at 500 feet or at 700 feet, the training is there to get to the surface and to survive. But if something goes horribly wrong, there's a grave risk of folks actually not coming home. Whereas on the surface, if you're in a frigate or destroyer, I commanded, that's where my background was. If you have a catastrophic engineering failure on the surface, you may not be making way, but you're still underway. And you still have time based on whatever's happening around you, but you should still have time to do the damage assessment, the damage repair, get a tow, get salvaged, whatever, but get home eventually. But submarines, it's a bit different. But having said that, the attraction and recruiting of submariners, the training, the education, the interpersonal skills, and the sustaining them through career, that's a huge challenge for any Navy. And so when you add the pressurized water reactor, the steam generator, the secondary circuit with the motor and turbo-driven generators, and the reduction gearing, the shaft line, and all of that into a nuclear-propelled submarine that is designed to take a torpedo and survive without a fuel leak. There's a lot that has to go into generating that crew. And that, I think, is part of the challenge that Admiral Meade and the team are really trying to get after. If you look at the United States, the USN Nuclear Power School is well known as having the highest academic and training standards of any unit in the US military, arguably any military unit in the world. And so you don't just go down to a recruiting center and say, hey, I want to be on a nuclear submariner. There's a very rigorous selection and training element, and you need to be able to understand nuclear thermohydraulics, reactor technology, metallurgical and materials engineering, radiation and nuclear safety. You need to understand the culture, which is mostly kind of checklist driven. In the nuclear space, and I think many of you obviously live or know this already, but it's not a place to innovate or to kind of make stuff up on the fly. And in some military units and in some, like in a ship, for example, a captain will often kind of innovate tactically. Even from an engineering perspective, kind of jury rigging temporary power solutions in order to get the mission done. But in a submarine, in a nuclear powered submarine, you don't jury rig. And so it's training that, it's understanding those standards, and it's knowing that that you will be checked. Your shipmates will be checking your work because everyone knows that they're depending on one another to be safe, to be effective, and to survive. So if we look at numbers, the Collins class, there's 58, there's 6 boats in Australia, there's 58 in a crew. Currently, I understand there's about 900 Dolphin qualified submariners. So they wear dolphins on their uniforms, that means they're qualified submariners. The Virginia class has a crew of 132. The Astute class in the UK has a crew of 98. The estimate is with 8 SSNs in Australia, the minimum sustainable Dolphin number is 2,300. So Navy needs to attract significantly more folks into the pipeline. And it takes about 16 years to qualify a engineering head of department in an SSN. So the engineering officer and the commanding officer of that first boat are already in the fleet, or they're at ADFA. And so Navy needs to identify these folks, get them over to the US or to the UK into the nuclear power schools, and then get them into submarines on posting so that they can get the high technical cognizance and operational experience required to get them through these various training and certification gates to be that crew of the future. But it's not just, so that's 2,300, but it's not just that number. So there's eight boats coming into Australia. There's 8 boats in the UK. So 4 are the nuclear-powered attack boats, and then there's 4 that are the strategic deterrent. But the estimate, or the number they use in the UK to support that capability is 30,000. So 30,000 people in the UK are involved in whether they work for BAE, for Babcock, for Rolls-Royce, or for Fraser-Nash, or for the regulator, or they're involved in various elements of the supply chain, or they are part of the infrastructure piece around supporting these submarines. Well, that's a 30,000 person assumption that we need to make here in Australia as well. So that's a bit eye-watering for a country that has no nuclear civil power generating capacity at the moment. Just a couple of other quick points here. So it's also the infrastructure, right? So the East Coast base, Port Adelaide, Stirling out in WA, jetties, synchro-lifts, dry docks, rail and road access for spent fuel. All of this has to be designed and built and sustained at a very high nuclear technical specification standard. Someone described it to me as being able to survive a 1 in a million year sort of catastrophic event. So that's going to require a huge number of civilian engineers to be geared and pivoted towards being part of this capability here in Australia. There's also the emergency management part of all of this, and so firefighters, and paramedics, council and state emergency management organizations all have to be trained to a level where they understand what are the sort of the worst case occurrences and how to train and be prepared for them. And that requires attracting people and training them and skilling them and whatnot. So there's a lot there. And so my final point is, and I've heard this from Jonathan, Admiral Meade himself, is that this is not a Navy capability that's being introduced to Australia. It's not even an ADF capability. It's not a defense capability. It's an Australian capability, and it's going to require a whole of nation commitment to setting the conditions to attract people into the sector, to incentivize them, to reward them, to train, and to give them, a sense of purpose in being part of Nuclear Australia. Thank you.